The American Dream on hold. Look at this image. This is a scene repeated across millions of neighborhoods in hundreds of American cities. A place where children play in the yard, where neighbors walk their dogs, where the grass is green and the streets are quiet. For generations, this image, this concept of homeownership, represented the very core of the American dream. It symbolized stability, security, and a pathway to building wealth for your family. It was the promise we made to ourselves, a covenant of prosperity rooted in individual enterprise and community investment. But for millions of Americans today, that dream is fading. It's no longer a certainty. It's a fantasy. The numbers don't lie. In major metropolitan areas across the United States, from San Francisco to Boston, from Austin to Miami, the cost of housing has skyrocketed far beyond the rate of inflation or wage growth. The median home price in many cities has reached unprecedented heights, demanding incomes that place them out of reach for a typical working professional, let alone a young family just starting out. Let's look at the data for a moment. In 1960, the median American family spent roughly 15% of their income on housing. Today, that figure often exceeds 30%, and in highly desirable areas, it can approach 50% or more. This isn't just a matter of tightening budgets. It's a structural barrier to economic opportunity. When housing costs become prohibitive, a cascade of negative effects begins to unfold. People are forced into longer commutes, sacrificing time with their families and contributing to gridlock and pollution. Businesses struggle to hire essential workers, nurses, teachers, firefighters because those workers simply cannot afford to live within a reasonable distance of their jobs. The result is a less dynamic, less competitive economy and a society increasingly stratified by wealth and opportunity. When faced with this crisis, what are the answers we most commonly hear? We hear a litany of supposed culprits: corporate landlords buying up properties, Wall Street speculation, greedy developers, high interest rates set by the Federal Reserve. These narratives dominate the discourse, pointing fingers at free market forces and capitalist institutions, demanding more regulation, more intervention, and more government programs to solve the problem. But what if I told you that nearly all of these explanations are fundamentally flawed? What if the crisis isn't caused by the excesses of the free market, but rather by its systematic suppression? This documentary is not just about housing, it's about economics. It's about challenging the pervasive myths that obscure the truth about prosperity in America. We will present a thesis that runs contrary to conventional wisdom, a thesis supported by decades of economic data and historical precedent. The true source of America's housing crisis lies not in the failure of capitalism, but in the failure of local bureaucracy. It's not the free market that has broken the housing supply. It's a complex, redundant, and often irrational system of local government regulations, zoning codes, permitting processes, and entrenched protectionist policies that has intentionally or unintentionally choked off the supply of new homes where they are needed most. For nearly 70 years, the United States built housing in abundance. Following World War II, America embarked on one of the greatest periods of expansion in human history. The concept of the suburban dream became a reality for millions, built on efficient, market-driven construction. The system, though imperfect, responded to supply and demand with remarkable agility. The change did not happen overnight. It was a gradual, creeping process of regulatory creep that began in earnest in the late 1960s and accelerated rapidly through the 1970s and 80s. The once flexible system became rigid, ossified by layers of local ordinances, minimum lot sizes, height restrictions, and community character preservation efforts that effectively made it illegal to build enough homes to meet demand. We are going to take a journey through the history of this regulatory capture. We will show how well-intentioned environmental and social policies were weaponized by existing homeowners and NIMBYs, or not in my backyard activists, to prevent development that might lower their property values or change their neighborhood as aesthetic. We will examine the economic mechanisms that transform small, seemingly innocuous regulations into enormous costs for developers and, ultimately, for consumers. This is a deep dive into the hidden costs of local government overreach and how a misguided attempt at central planning at the local level has created an economic crisis that impacts every American family, whether they own a home, rent an apartment, or simply seek a better job in a dynamic city. We will look at specific case studies from across the nation, analyze historical data, and dismantle the anti-market narratives that have dominated this debate for far too long. The story of the American housing crisis is the story of supply and demand, and how one side of that equation, supply, was systematically handicapped by bureaucracy. Chapter 1: The Myth of Scarcity versus the Reality of Restriction. Let's start with a basic premise. Land in America is not scarce. The continental United States spans over 3.8 million square miles. The vast majority of this land remains undeveloped, open space, or low-density rural areas. If we look at satellite maps, even our most populous metropolitan areas consist largely of sprawling suburbs and undeveloped tracts. The argument that we simply ran out of space to build housing is patently false. The scarcity is artificial. It is a man-made construct created by regulatory policy. To understand this, we must first examine the concept of buildable land. Buildable land is not simply open space. It is lands owned to allow for construction. In many major U.S. cities, particularly those that have experienced significant population growth, a staggering amount of land is simply off-limits for dense development. Consider the example of San Francisco. A study by the San Francisco Planning Department in the early 2010s identified that approximately 75% of the city's land area was zoned exclusively for single-family homes or other low-density uses. This means that even if a developer wanted to build an apartment complex or a row of townhouses in those neighborhoods, it would be illegal. This phenomenon is not unique to San Francisco. In Boston, a majority of the land is zoned for single-family homes, despite the city's status as a major economic hub with a critical need for high-density housing near employment centers. The same pattern holds true for suburbs surrounding New York City, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles. This creates a fundamental disconnect between economic reality and regulatory reality. The market dictates that people want to live near jobs, transportation hubs, and amenities. The demand for housing in these areas is high, which in a true free market would lead to higher density development. Property owners would find it profitable to redevelop their single-family lots into duplexes, triplexes, or small apartment buildings to meet the demand. But zoning prevents this. It creates what economists call supply inelasticity. In simple terms, when demand goes up, supply cannot respond effectively. When demand exceeds supply, prices rise rapidly. This isn't a failure of capitalism. It's capitalism being tied to the tracks by local government. The consequence is a dramatic disparity in housing costs. A study by economists Edward Glaser and Joseph Gyurko highlights this phenomenon by comparing housing prices in different U.S. cities. They found that in cities with highly restrictive zoning, the cost of a home significantly exceeded the physical cost of construction, the cost of labor and materials. This difference, the zoning tax, can account for hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-demand areas. Where does this tax go? It doesn't fund infrastructure or services. It is simply a value captured by existing homeowners who benefit from artificial scarcity. Their property values are inflated precisely because local government has restricted the ability of others to move into the area. So, when we talk about the American housing crisis, we must first discard the notion that we are running out of space. We are not. We are running out of legal ways to build on that space. The free market, if allowed, would provide solutions. But we have replaced market efficiency with bureaucratic control. The original sin, single-family zoning SFZ. Let's trace the origins of this restrictive approach, starting with one of the most significant interventions, single-family zoning. The concept of zoning itself originated in the early 20th century, largely as a response to industrial pollution and public health concerns. The idea was to keep chemical factories out of residential areas and prevent tenements from overcrowding city blocks. It was initially justified on health and safety grounds and, in that context, had some merit. However, single-family zoning, specifically designed to protect neighborhood character, quickly became a powerful tool for economic and, in many cases, racial exclusion. While early U.S. Supreme Court cases struck down explicitly racial zoning ordinances, single-family zoning became the de facto replacement. By setting minimum lot sizes and requiring only single-family homes, cities could effectively price out lower-income families and minorities, restricting them to high-density, less desirable areas. This practice, known as exclusionary zoning, gained prominence in the post-World War II era. As suburbs grew rapidly, existing homeowners sought to preserve their property values by ensuring that undesirable forms of housing, duplexes, townhouses, or apartments were not built nearby. Consider the example of Levittown, New York, a famous symbol of post-World War II suburban expansion. While Levittown itself was built efficiently and at scale, the subsequent regulations in surrounding communities quickly moved to prevent further large-scale, high-density development. The ethos shifted from providing affordable housing to protecting established communities from change. The single-family home became the default and often the only legal option in large swaths of American suburbs. This created a profound economic inefficiency. Land that could support multiple families was legally restricted to only one. Let's compare this to Houston, Texas. Houston is unique among major American cities for its lack of traditional zoning codes. While it has some land use regulations, it does not have the comprehensive zoning ordinances found in most other cities. This non-zoning approach has allowed Houston to respond to demand more quickly than other large cities. When demand for housing increases, developers in Houston can more easily build multifamily structures or townhomes. This flexibility has historically kept housing costs more stable and affordable in Houston compared to other high-growth areas like Los Angeles or San Francisco. While Houston has experienced price increases, particularly in recent years due to a massive influx of population, its long-term affordability advantage demonstrates the power of a less regulated market. The central issue with single-family zoning is its fundamental opposition to density. Density, often maligned, is actually critical for a healthy, vibrant economy. It allows for efficient public transit, reduces commute times, and supports local businesses. Single-family zoning effectively bans density, pushing housing further and further out from employment centers, creating the sprawling suburbs and congestion we now take for granted. The original sin of zoning was turning a simple health regulation into an engine of economic exclusion. The bureaucratic maze, permitting and approval delays. If zoning dictates what you can build, then permitting determines when and if you can build it. The permitting and approval process in many American cities has evolved into a labyrinth and bureaucratic maze, specifically designed to delay and deter new construction. To illustrate this, let's consider the journey of a developer attempting to build a multifamily apartment complex in a high-demand city. First, the developer must submit extensive plans to the local planning department. This initial phase often takes months, during which time bureaucrats review everything from setbacks and parking ratios to aesthetic considerations and environmental impacts. The process rarely ends there. The project must often go through multiple rounds of public hearings. These hearings, though seemingly democratic, are frequently dominated by a small group of highly engaged existing homeowners, the NIMBYs, who oppose any new development on principle. For a large project, the developer must typically seek approval from multiple local boards: the Planning Board, the Zoning Board of Appeals, the Conservation Commission, and sometimes even a Design Review Committee. Each committee has its own set of rules, often contradictory, and each meeting represents another potential delay, another opportunity for the project to be stalled or rejected entirely. The financial consequences of these delays are enormous. Economists refer to these costs as soft costs. While hard costs include materials and labor, soft costs include architectural fees, legal expenses, interest payments on construction loans, and a host of administrative overhead expenses. When a project is delayed for months or even years in permitting, the carrying costs accumulate rapidly. The developer must pay interest on loans for a property that is generating no revenue. They must pay legal fees to defend against lawsuits filed by neighborhood groups. They must adjust plans repeatedly to meet changing demands from different government bodies. According to a study by the National Association of Home Builders (NAHB), regulatory costs now account for an average of 25% of the total cost of building a single-family home. In high-cost areas, this percentage is significantly higher. This creates a perverse incentive. When the cost of development rises, developers must build more expensive, high-end units to justify the project financially. A project that might have been affordable to middle-income families becomes economically unviable because of bureaucratic delays. The process itself becomes the barrier. In a true market, a developer would build what the market demands efficiently. In today's highly regulated environment, a developer must first appease a bureaucracy before they can build anything at all. This transforms the housing market from a system focused on efficiency and consumer value into a system dominated by compliance and political maneuvering. NIMBY Veto, weaponizing community character. The most potent force behind restrictive housing policy is often not a distant bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., but rather your next-door neighbor. This phenomenon is known as NIMBYism, not in my backyard. NIMBYs are existing homeowners who leverage local political processes to oppose new housing development, particularly multifamily homes or affordable housing projects in their neighborhoods. Their arguments are typically wrapped in rhetoric of preserving community character, protecting property values, or maintaining neighborhood safety. The economic reality, however, is that these arguments are often a thinly veiled defense of their personal financial interests. For existing homeowners, housing represents not just shelter but often their largest investment. New supply, especially high-density supply, could potentially lower the value of their existing home by increasing the housing stock. While this would be beneficial for society as a whole by making housing more affordable, it represents a direct threat to the accumulated wealth of existing homeowners. NIMBYism thrives because local politics gives existing residents disproportionate power. Local elections often have very low turnout, meaning that a small, highly motivated group of homeowners can exert enormous influence over local planning commissions and city councils. These politicians seeking re-election often prioritize the concerns of current voters over the needs of future residents. The NIMBY veto takes many forms. It can be direct opposition during public hearings, citing traffic concerns or school overcrowding, but it often extends to weaponizing existing regulations. A notable example of this in California is the use of the California Environmental Quality Act (CEQA). CEQA was originally passed in 1970 to ensure that state and local agencies consider the environmental impact of their actions. However, NIMBY groups regularly use CEQA lawsuits to halt housing developments on frivolous grounds. Consider the case of a student housing project in Berkeley, California, that was halted by a CEQA lawsuit. The lawsuit claimed the project would create too much noise and increase shadows on a local park, arguing these were negative environmental impacts. This tactic, known as greenwashing, uses environmental protection legislation to achieve anti-development goals. The irony is that new, high-density housing near public transit, by allowing people to live closer to their jobs and use public transportation, is demonstrably better for the environment than forcing people to live in sprawling suburbs and commute long distances in cars. NIMBYism fundamentally misunderstands the source of a community's value. A truly vibrant community is one where people can afford to live, work, and raise families. By prioritizing a static character over economic dynamism and opportunity, NIMBYs ultimately degrade the very communities they claim to protect, making them exclusive and stagnant. The geography of housing inequality, the U.S. Divergence. To truly grasp the impact of local bureaucracy on the American economy, we must look at a phenomenon known as the Great Divergence. This refers to the growing gap in economic opportunity between different regions of the country, directly linked to local housing policy. In a free market economy, labor mobility is critical for efficiency. If there are high-paying jobs in City A, workers from City B should be able to move to City A to fill those jobs. This movement of people increases overall economic productivity as workers are matched with the best opportunities. However, when housing costs in high-growth knowledge economy cities like Seattle, Boston, or San Francisco become prohibitively expensive, labor mobility slows down dramatically. Workers cannot afford to move to where the jobs are plentiful. The consequences for the national economy are staggering. A study by economists Chang-Tai Hsieh and Enrico Moretti found that restrictive housing policies in a few major metropolitan areas, specifically San Francisco, New York, and San Jose, reduced U.S. GDP by as much as 3.7% in 2009. By preventing workers from moving to highly productive areas, these cities essentially act as a brake on national economic growth. We can observe a clear divergence between cities with historically loose zoning regulations and those with strict regulations. Consider the contrast between Austin, Texas, and San Jose, California in the 2000s and early 2010s. Both experienced massive growth in the tech sector. Austin, with its historically low regulatory burden, saw its housing supply respond to demand more quickly. While prices rose, they remained relatively affordable compared to California's tech hubs, allowing the city to attract and retain workers. San Jose, on the other hand, experienced a severe supply bottleneck due to restrictive zoning and lengthy permitting processes. As a result, housing prices skyrocketed, forcing many workers to accept long commutes from less expensive areas or to leave the region entirely. The cost of living became a major impediment to economic growth. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle of inequality. Wealthy individuals who own property in these restrictive cities see their wealth increase simply by restricting supply. Meanwhile, those who cannot afford to buy are trapped in a cycle of high rents or forced to leave for lower opportunity areas. This housing inequality, born from local government intervention, isn't just about individual hardship. It's about national economic stagnation. By preventing the free flow of labor, we are undermining the very engine of American capitalism. The government, rather than facilitating opportunity, is acting as a gatekeeper for those already in power.